For products where collaboration is a main feature, notifications about actions inside your app, like when a new comment is added or a new asset is uploaded, can help you drive usage and retention. But in addition to sending notifications about actions that are happening inside of your product, you can also include notifications about how a user is getting value out of your product. For example, Spotify users love getting that Spotify Wrapped email every year. It gives them information about which artists they've listened to, how many minutes they've listened, and so on. In this video, I'm going to show you how to implement a similar feature in a collaboration app built with Next.js using Nock and Tinybird. We'll look at how we can push events from Next.js into Tinybird. Then we'll create a data pipeline that transforms those events into user statistics. And then we can query that pipeline from a scheduled workflow in Nock to send a customized wrap style email. To get started, we'll use this collaboration app that we use at Nock to do demos. It's called Collab.io. And inside of it, there are different projects and you can upload assets and then comment on those assets. What we'll do is modify our function that saves a comment to also store some analytics data in Tinybird that we can fetch in a later step to display our wrapped email. But before we make any changes to the codebase, we'll need to first create a Tinybird account and a workspace if you don't have one. If you haven't used Tinybird before, it's a data infrastructure tool that helps you create analytics features for your products. In the next step, we'll create an events data source to capture data every time someone makes a comment. With the Tinybird Events API, all we need to do is click New Data Source, and then Tinybird will give us a URL so that we can upload JSON directly into that data source. When we send a JSON payload, Tinybird handles inferring the schema directly from that payload. So I'll just copy the fetch call that Tinybird creates for us and use that in our application. To send these analytics events to Tinybird, let's open the Create New Comment Server action in our Next.js project. And then we'll find a good place after we've already saved this comment in the database using Prisma, and after we've triggered a Nock workflow to alert workspace users about the comment. Then we can go ahead and just paste this fetch call in there and pass in any of the comment fields that we want saved as a part of this analytics data. We'll also want to adjust the name of the data source directly in the URL to make sure that it gets named appropriately. Now, what I'm going to do here is just send the entire comment object to Tinybird. But since this is analytics data, we might not actually need all of that. So it's always a good idea to think about the smallest amount of data that you can send to something like Tinybird to still create the queries that we need for our analytics. So now with this in place, if we save it and actually run this server action in the application by leaving a few comments, and then we come back into Tinybird, we should see a new data source is available for us with the name that we specified in the URL. And if we click through, we can also see that Tinybird has inferred an entire table schema based on the JSON object that we sent as a part of that API request. While we're still dealing with Tinybird, let's go ahead and do the next step of that configuration as well. So once we have all of our data in a data source, the next step is creating a data pipe, which is going to become an API endpoint that we can use to query for particular data. Now, pipes let you create a flow of different nodes with different SQL queries that can both query and transform the data you retrieve from your sources and then expose that as an API endpoint. So we'll go ahead and create a new pipe and write a SQL query so that we can select all of the data from our comments data source, where we're passing in the author ID that's going to match the one inside of the database. And then we'll also add some additional parameters on here so that we're only selecting comments made in the last week. Next, we'll add another node that's input is the content from the first node. And inside this second node, we're going to aggregate the information from our first query into things like total comments, unique assets, and total characters written that we get from that first transformation node. That way, when we query this data pipe from Knock, we'll get back JSON shaped exactly the way that we want it to create our activity digest email. Now that we have our API endpoint exposed in Tinybird, let's open Knock and unpack the workflow that sends this activity digest email. The first step in our workflow is going to be a fetch request. We'll provide the URL to our Tinybird endpoint, as well as a token that we need to fetch this data. We'll also pass the recipient ID as the author ID param that Tinybird expects. Next, we'll update the configuration on this fetch step so that instead of merging the data we retrieve from Tinybird directly into the workflow run scope, we'll assign that to a particular key called Tinybird so that it's easier to access in our template. We can run a test of this to see what gets returned, to check that all of our configuration details are correct and that our data pipeline is working as we expect. Next, let's take a look at the email step that sends this activity digest with Postmark. Inside of the email body, we're using Liquid to template out different parts of this email message. The first Liquid tag at the top is doing some variable assignment, and it pulls out our Tinybird data array into a variable called summary data so that it's just a little bit easier to work with. And you can see that we're also using some Liquid filters to display our aggregate statistics, in that we're including some conditional logic at the end to playfully describe this person's writing style based on the total number of characters that they've written. Once we've saved our changes, we can open up the test runner inside of the workflow builder and run a test for this. From there, we should be able to preview the results of our message in the logs. Now, the last thing that we'll need to do is create an interface so that someone can register for this scheduled workflow directly from our application. To do that, we'll go ahead and add a button to our user settings component. And when they click this button, we're gonna run a server action to create this scheduled workflow in Knock. Inside of this server action, we'll use the Knock Node SDK to create a scheduled workflow run for this user that runs every week on Friday at 5:30 p.m. in their local time zone. This SDK method accepts a JSON object that describes the repeat frequency of our scheduled workflow and allows you to express some really specific rules about how you want this scheduled workflow to behave. Once we add the schedule for the user, if you navigate to the user's profile in the Knock dashboard and open up the Schedules tab, you can see it listed there. Awesome. Thanks for watching. In this video, we looked at how you can create a Spotify Wrapped-like activity digest email that's sent to your users on a weekly basis. We used Next.js, Knock, and Tinybird for different parts of this process. Using Tinybird's Event API, we ingested comment activity directly from our Next.js application. Then, using their data pipe feature, we created another API endpoint to give us summary statistics of user comment activity. And finally, we used Knock's scheduled workflow feature to query Tinybird for that data and send a customized email to your users. Thanks for watching, and Knock on.